Welcome back to DRM News. We've been getting a ton of questions about Pope Francis lately.
Yeah,
It's no wonder. I mean, the guy's been making headlines.
left and right.
So we thought it'd be a good time to dig into some of these stories and see what's going on.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? You see him dealing with these health issues, taking a strong stance on U.S. immigration policies, and then championing children's rights.
Right.
It paints a picture of a leader who is juggling quite a lot.
Yeah, a lot to unpack for sure.
Yeah.
Let's start with the health thing.
Uh-huh.
The news is that 86-year-old Pope Francis has been hospitalized in Rome for bronchitis.
Uh-huh.
This isn't his first time dealing with this, right? He was hospitalized for the same thing back in March of last year.
That's right. And it makes you think about the toll that this must be taking on him.
Yeah.
We know he's had to delegate some of his duties like speech reading and even cancel events.
Oh, wow.
Leading the Catholic Church is no small feat, and doing it while battling a recurring illness,
Right.
that's got to be incredibly challenging.
It makes you wonder about the future, too. I mean, bronchitis at 86.
Right.
What does that mean for his long-term ability to lead? The Catholic Church is facing some pretty serious issues right now, from declining membership to internal disagreements.
Yeah.
Can he really steer the ship through all that while he's dealing with all these health problems?
It's a big question, and it adds a layer of urgency to everything else that he's doing. Like his outspoken criticism of U.S. immigration policy, it's not just like a casual comment either. He wrote a whole letter directly challenging the current administration's stance, particularly their approach to deportations.
Yeah. And he didn't hold back.
Yeah.
He even took on Vice President J.D. Vance, who has tried to justify these stricter policies using Catholic teaching.
Yeah.
It's a pretty bold move for a religious leader to, wade into the politics of another country like that.
Yeah. What's interesting is how Pope Francis is using Catholic theology to counter those arguments. There's a line in his letter that really struck me. What is built on the basis of force and not on the truth about the equal dignity of every human being begins badly and will end badly.
Wow.
He's essentially saying that these policies violate fundamental human rights.
And, of course, that sparked a whole debate.
Of course.
Tom Homan, the former U.S. border czar, fired back, pointing to the Vatican's own walls and saying the Pope should focus on his own backyard.
Right.
But then you have the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops standing firmly behind the Pope, which just adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
It really highlights the tension between different ideologies. On the one hand, you have those who prioritize national security and border control, even if it means using forceful measures.
Yeah.
On the other, you have those who believe in the inherent dignity of every human being and see a moral obligation to welcome those seeking refuge.
Right.
And both sides are claiming religious justification for their stance.
So what do you make of all this? Is the Pope overstepping his boundaries by getting involved in U.S. politics, or is he speaking truth to power?
Yeah.
And how does this clash with the counter-arguments from people like Tom Homan and the potential hypocrisy of the Vatican itself having walls?
It's not an easy answer, is it? But this isn't the first time he's butted heads with the U.S. over immigration. Remember back in 2016 during the Trump administration when he said, anyone who builds walls to keep out migrants is not a Christian.
Oh, yeah.
He clearly sees this as a core moral issue, and he's not afraid to take a stand, even if it ruffles some feathers.
It definitely seems like a recurring theme for him, this idea of standing up for the vulnerable.
Yeah.
Which actually brings us to the next story,
Okay.
a seemingly more positive one, his focus on children's rights.
Right, and this is more than just words. He recently hosted the first ever international summit on children's rights at the Vatican.
Wow.
They tackled some really tough issues there: poverty, lack of education exploitation, even the impact of climate change on kids. It was a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and I think it shows how seriously he's taking this issue. He's not just talking about it. He's bringing together experts and advocates from around the world to try to find solutions.
Right.
And he's not stopping there. He also announced he's going to be writing an apostolic exhortation specifically on children's rights.
Wow.
Have you ever seen a pope do that before?
An apostolic exhortation is a pretty big deal in the Catholic Church. It's basically a document where the Pope outlines key principles and calls for specific actions.
Right.
So the fact that he's devoting one entirely to children's rights, it's a clear signal that this is a top priority for him. And I think it speaks to his legacy. It's like he's saying, look, this is what I want to be remembered for, fighting for the most vulnerable among us, protecting the future.
That's powerful, especially when you consider what some of these kids are going through.
Yeah.
Queen Rania of Jordan, who spoke at the summit, shared that 96% of children in Gaza live in fear of imminent death.
That's a horrifying statistic.
It really drives home the urgency of the situation.
It does.
It makes you realize that these aren't just abstract issues we're talking about.
No.
These are real children, real lives being impacted by poverty, conflict, and injustice.
Right.
So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on all of this? How do you see these different threads? His health, his stance on immigration, his focus on children's rights all coming together. Is there a larger picture here?
I think you might be onto something there. It's easy to view these news stories as separate events, but maybe they're all part of a bigger narrative,
Okay.
a kind of legacy that Pope Francis is trying to build.
Okay, so let's explore that. What kind of legacy do you think he's aiming for?
Well, he's certainly not afraid to shake things up.
Right.
He's challenging powerful institutions, he's speaking out against injustice, and he's advocating for those who often get ignored. It's a pretty radical approach, especially for a pope.
Right. And it's interesting how he's doing all of this while dealing with his own health challenges.
Yeah.
It's like he knows that time might be limited, and he's determined to make the most of it. That urgency really comes across in his actions and his words.
Definitely. And this focus on social justice, especially for the marginalized, has been a consistent thread throughout his papacy. Think back to the very beginning, washing the feet of prisoners,
Right.
including women and Muslims.
Oh, wow.
That was a really powerful symbol of his commitment to reaching out to those on the fringes of society.
Yeah, and his encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si,
Right.
that was another bold move. I mean, he basically called out world leaders for their inaction on climate change, saying that it's a moral imperative to protect the planet.
Yeah.
That's not exactly typical Pope stuff.
It's like he's saying, I'm not just the leader of the Catholic Church. I'm a citizen of the world, and I have a responsibility to speak out against injustice wherever I see it. And that message seems to resonate with people far beyond the Catholic Church. He's become a moral authority on the global stage.
So we've talked about his willingness to address controversial issues and his commitment to social justice. But how does his focus on children's rights fit into all of this?
I think it goes beyond just caring for children. It's about recognizing their vulnerability, their dependence on adults to create a just and equitable world for them to inherit.
Right.
And it ties back to his concern for the environment, for migrants, for all those who are marginalized or voiceless. It's about protecting the future, about building a better world for generations to come.
And by focusing on children, he's also kind of shining a light on our own responsibilities.
Exactly.
You know, he's asking us to think about the world that we're creating for them.
Yeah.
And whether we're doing enough to ensure their safety, their well-being, and their future.
Exactly. It's a powerful message, especially in today's world. We're facing so many interconnected challenges. Climate change, social inequality, political polarization. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed to think, what can I possibly do about any of this?
Right.
But maybe that's part of his point. Maybe he's trying to inspire us to take action.
Yeah.
However small, to make a difference in our own corners of the world.
Yeah.
To recognize that even though the problems are complex, we all have a role to play in creating a better future.
It reminds me of that quote from Nelson Mandela. There is no passion to be found playing small in, settling for a life that is less than the one you are capable of living.
Oh, that's good.
It seems to me that Pope Francis is living a life that is anything but small.
He's definitely not your typical pope.
Yeah.
And whether you agree with him or not, there's no denying that he's shaking things up and leaving a lasting impact on the Catholic Church and on the world as a whole.
Absolutely. And that's what makes him so fascinating to observe, to try to understand. He's a man of deep faith who's also deeply engaged with the realities of the modern world.
Yeah.
He's a leader who's both compassionate and challenging, who's not afraid to speak his mind, even when it makes people uncomfortable.
Right.
And that's what makes this whole conversation so intriguing.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at a series of news stories. We're getting a glimpse into the life and legacy of a truly remarkable individual. Someone who's using his platform to try to make a positive difference in the world.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what kind of world would we live in if more leaders, both religious and secular, approached their roles with the same sense of compassion, courage, and commitment to justice that Pope Francis seems to embody?
That's a powerful question to ponder, and one that I think we'll all be grappling with for years to come as we continue to witness the unfolding story of Pope Francis and his papacy. So to bring it all back to what we started with, his health, his criticism of U.S. immigration policy, and his advocacy for children's rights.
It all seems to paint a picture of a man racing against time, driven by a deep sense of urgency to leave the world a better place than he found it.
And who knows, maybe that's the most powerful legacy of all. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Pope Francis' health, his criticism of U.S. immigration policies, and his advocacy for children's rights. And it seems like there's this common thread running through it all.
Yeah, this feeling that he's racing against time to address these really pressing issues
Right.
and leave a lasting impact on the world.
Which brings us back to the question we posed earlier.
Yeah.
What kind of legacy do you think he is building? What will Pope Francis ultimately be remembered for?
It's still unfolding, of course, but I think we're already seeing some of those defining characteristics. He'll likely be remembered as a pope who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, who spoke truth to power, and who prioritized the needs of the
He's
marginalized.
certainly not your typical pope, that's for sure. And regardless of whether you agree with his every stance, there's no denying that he's making waves and leaving his mark on the church and the world.
I think that's what makes him so captivating. He defies easy categorization.
Yeah.
He's a man of deep faith, but also deeply engaged with the complexities of the modern world. He's compassionate yet challenging, willing to speak his mind even when it makes people uncomfortable.
And that's what has made this deep dive so fascinating. We haven't just been looking at news stories. We've been getting a glimpse into the life and work of a truly remarkable individual who's using his position to try and make a positive difference.
And perhaps that's the most important takeaway for our listeners.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the world we want to live in, regardless of our beliefs or backgrounds.
Absolutely. Whether it's advocating for those in need, standing up for what we believe in, or simply striving to live a life of purpose and compassion, we can all draw inspiration from Pope Francis's example.
Well, thanks for joining us on this exploration of Pope Francis's recent actions and their potential impact.
It's been great having you.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with the world around you.
And we'll see all of you next time for another deep dive.